Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Halakhe, about the latest election together with the survival of the South African president of the no confidence vote recently in the assembly. What do you make of these events? Are we seeing a whole generation of political leaders in Africa survived and will continue with their political path?
I think there are two things that we can speak to about, the situation unfolding in South Africa. One, the ANC, much as it's losing a great deal of support from, the cadre of people who have been supporting them since even before the end of apartheid in 1991, there are pockets of people who still believe that ANC is the party to beat. And also, let's not be dissuaded, because for all his fault, Jacob Zuma still continues to ride on the brand that is the ANC, but also himself as a politician who knows how to maneuver the party machinery. He's an insider from the days when they were, in exile. So, but also the other second trend that we need to contend with is the fact that despite its larger than life presence, ANC is facing competition from within, from people who feel like ANC is not, representing their interest. So it's a competition of these two particular, interests.
Yeah, but of course my question is not just about South Africa, but also about Kenya. The president, Mr. Kenyatta, once again is likely to be the president of his country, Kenya, with this election. So my question really is about political leadership. How much does this show that this whole generation of political leaders will once again be the leaders of the next term, 5 or even 10 years? What would that mean?
Well, I mean, in the Kenyan case, I mean, for Uhuru Kenyatta, this is his second and last constitutional term. One of the things that gets underestimated all of the time when looking into African political processes is the capacity of the incumbency to use the state resources, where the distinction between the party as well as the state is not very clear. And in the Kenyan case, this has come up several times during the campaign, when cabinet secretaries, a fairly apolitical position, have been going around campaigning for the incumbent under the name of, ensuring that they are doing their ministry's job. The president and the deputy president have been using the state resources. Whenever they travel in the state helicopter, they stay in the state lodges, and so that already places the opposition to a disadvantage.
Well, whether the helicopter really helped a lot in the election is questionable, but certainly it's one of those arguments. But Ms. He, I want to go to you about the two questions raised by Mr. Halakhe from Africa. One is the relationship between party and state. The other is the relationship between an individual and the leader of the party and the party itself. One, of course, is the case of Kenya. The other is the case of South Africa.
Yes, these two questions relates with different two kinds of survival.
That's
because we heard about this survival of those leadership. Because for the Uhuru Kenyatta, I think he's surviving. He's not surviving. He's sick for the second term, because he has been doing very good for his first presidency term. Because you can see the economic performance in Kenya and still leads the way in the Eastern African community. And also this relations between the party and the state, I think has been doing quite good. People, regards this party, like led by Uhuru Kenyatta, can lead the state forward. So, and also this is also a test for mature democracy in Kenya, because they have been doing this presidency election for, I think this is the 5th one already. So all those previous one, even though 10 years ago, it has caused some post-election chaos. But the previous one, I think, is in the 2013, also between these two candidates. Now we have seen those Odinga and Kenyatta, but that one, 2013, has been very peaceful. Even this time around, even before this election, I have a very strong confidence for this peaceful election, because people has
now
been...
there are protests though.
Yes.
But that's natural too.
Yeah, yes, people has been educated from those 10 years post-election
Is
chaos.
the South Africa case similar to this or different?
South African case is different survival, yes, because ANC, like my colleague has mentioned, this party has been in power for more than 20 years.
After the apartheid,
yes,
of course.
but now it's gradually losing its reputation among those even black people, because they haven't seen the economic situation has been improved. So those, especially those radical, I think black parties now have been challenged. Those dominance position of the ANC. They even calling for the second revolution, that is the economic the revolution. Before they got the political rights, equal rights for voting, but now they think they still lag behind, far behind with those the white people.
So what kind of revolution that we are talking about here, it is still up to interpretation. And when we talk about the African leadership, we see in history, Africa has seen leaders that have been in office for at least 3 decades. Those in power for the last 38 years are leaders in Equatorial Guinea and also Angola. A close third at 37 years in office is Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, while the current Uganda leader, who has been in power for 31 years. Well, whether their system has produced the leadership that would let them to be in the office for that long is up to their country to interpret. But what we are seeing is an interesting phenomenon. That is, what about the newer generation of politicians in those countries? And how are they working with this, shall we say, traditionally holding office generation in the highest position? Meanwhile, how shall we interpret the economic and social transitions in those countries and the capabilities of the current leadership? Ms. He, very briefly, your analysis.
Yeah, because we will see another phenomenon, that is those number of those long-stay presidents in African countries now get less and less. Not, rather than get more and more. Comparing with the situation during the Cold War, there are more such kind of long, even lifelong presidency in the African continent. So those remaining, those several you just mentioned, I think that everyone, they have different background, they have different national condition. Like President Robert Mugabe, he has been the nation, the country founder ever since the country got independence from the British colonial rule. So he has his those roots goes with him. But luckily, because he has a very good health, so he can continue to serve his job. But he also has his political wisdom, so he can, crack down even those opposition party. Opposition party cannot unite themselves also together. It's not a competitor at all for the Robert Mugabe himself and his party. So anyway, I think different countries have a different case. The reason they can continue their rule also because they can maintain some kind of stability. All those countries with those long, stay presidency, they don't have any political conflict or a civil war, something like that.
Very interesting, your analysis. Of course, that's one of the perspectives. We're also joined by Mr. Emira Woods, who is an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. in the U.S. Ms. Woods, welcome to our program. Do you agree with the analysis presented by the previous panelist?
Well, I'm happy to join you. I didn't hear the full analysis with the technical issues on this end, but clearly there is much underway in terms of democracy and push of democracy, particularly in the younger generations. We have to look at the demographics across the continent, and you have increasingly young people who are voting based on their interests, not their geographic or ethnic identity, but looking at the broader interests and the long-term future of the country, right? So I think you are having new pressures on leadership, new demands, particularly from young people who are parts of social movements demanding change, demanding that their voice be heard. So whether it's from the Gambia, you had Gambia has decided, driven by young people, in Democratic Republic of the Congo, you have groups like Telema, in Senegal, groups like Yanamar. These are young people, hip-hop artists, poets, musicians that are leading the charge, demanding democracy be held, demanding that the voice of the people be respected. And it is those voices that I think bode well for the future, not only of those individual countries, but for the continent as a whole.
But there is a challenge to leadership worldwide about what they should react and how they would react in an ever-changing world, particularly very recently, we see job losses among the younger generation, and you talk about the younger generation. But on the other hand, Mr. Halakhe, what do you make of the quite sustainable leadership in some of the countries we just mentioned, vis-a-vis the other countries mentioned by Ms. Woods? Your views?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with the previous speaker. The reality is, I mean, like, Africa is not a monolithic, continent. I mean, like, all from South Africa to Egypt and from coast to coast. I think there are obviously areas where African leadership needs to improve, but also there are areas where young, detribalized, urban, well-traveled Africans are actually changing, the faces of politics. Even in places like Kenya, where a lot of attention has gone to the national politics, at the local level, independent candidates that do not belong to, the mainstream political parties are actually gaining a lot of traction. Never mind, also social media platforms are providing most of these Africans, whether it's in South Africa or in Kenya, or let's say even in Egypt, or even in Gambia, or even Senegal, where Africans, where young people are organizing and mobilizing and making demands on their political leadership. There is a small group of disparate, leaderless, if you want, of young Africans making demands that is, they congregate under an umbrella of called hashtag KOT, that is Kenyans on Twitter.
Right.
The amount of changes, although sometimes it's very disaggregated, is really tremendous.
That is tremendous, but at the same time, what we are seeing right now are very different narratives. In some international media coverage of those happening on the ground, you see a rather skeptical coverage of the national politics in many of the countries that we mentioned today. In other coverage, and if you talk to people over there, there are different interpretations as to what is happening. Even on social media, you hear all the views. But as you may know, with the US election, you will never be able to trust the social media in terms of when there's polling, or there's numbers, or there's so-called political analysis and assessment. So who should we listen to? What exactly is happening on the ground? An example to you, Ms. Woods. There have been so much skeptical analysis about the South African president, Mr. Zuma. However, he and his cabinet survived the 6th time no confidence vote. And this time, even though many of his party members goes to the other camp, he still survived. So what we read, is it really what is going on the ground? What we try to interpret, is it really what is in the hearts of the people? Ms. Woods.
I think we have to look at all the forces and understand that there are different ways to get information, right? But clearly, South Africa is in an interesting place. You have the African National Congress. It's the oldest political party on the African continent, been around over 100 years, has tremendous sway in the country where, independence just came in 1994. And so while you have a very strong youth movement that started with the Fees Must Fall campaign and went to the Zuma Must Go, broad, overwhelming push from people across the country, you have a party that is very solidly entrenched. And so while you had some members of the African National Congress able to kind of vote the will of the people, you had others looking at their own personal interests, will they still have a job at the end of the day after their vote, and those kinds of narrow, short-term, considerations. So I think we have to look really more broadly, understand that change comes slowly sometimes. It's very rare to have examples like Burkina Faso, where people taking to the streets, again, led by young people and trade unionists and others, took 10 days to bring down the former regime of Blaise Compaoré. But most often it takes time. And so particularly in a country like South Africa, what you see is that the change is incremental. And we have to understand the analysis that's coming out, both from the formal political structures, but also from the informal, from those young people on social media?
Well, one of the things, Mr. Halakhe, that people are talking about when it comes to South Africa, for example, is the stability of that country. Even though you have a lot of economic difficulties, but stability and sustainability of the African National Congress, this party itself, is still one of the priorities for the parliament members when it comes to this vote. So when we talk about all of these, different voices, is it really likely to be a smooth transition? And how much are we going to see changes in politics? Changes in politics sometimes is for the better, sometimes it's not necessarily going to get better. We have to point that out first, of course. Ms. Halakhe. Mr. Halakhe.
I beg you, I heard only parts of your question. You are saying that is this sustainable, right?
Well, if you cannot hear my words for now, I would go to Ms. He because we're really running out of time at this time. Ms. He, would you like to take that question?
Oh yes, I agree with our colleagues from the U.S. because changes takes place in a slow way and a quiet way. Because for the ANC in South African case, they cannot just enjoy everything they have without any worry. They have to worry. They have to have their own eager to change with themselves, like those policies, like how to give them more chances for those unemployment youth. So those are the challenges because if they cannot bring those beneficial of those reform and the economic benefit to those unemployment, those youth, and then there's a danger for their governance, and also that's a chances for all those opposition parties. So those democracy, I think, also goes with those things like change, but the change, of course, needs to be better rather than goes to a lot of chaos.
Well, many of the countries that we mentioned today are developing countries, and some of them are even emerging economies, such as South Africa. So, Ms. Woods, how do you interpret, how the economic development are going together with the political changes, or actually they have to be interpreted in different ways? Ms. Woods, very briefly.
Well, I think that's the most critical question, because I think we have to look at the economics to understand what's happening, and particularly with those young people. It is those young people who are without jobs that are most active in terms of the political pressures from below. So I think we've got to understand the need for countries around the continent to put the interests of particularly their young people first. So that is, addressing issues of unemployment, addressing the vast inequality that is rampant in country after country, but especially in countries like South Africa, one of the most unequal countries, in the world, but also addressing, long-term issues like, how to gain value out of the manufacturing that's so needed from the raw materials in their country. So many vast riches of whether it's diamonds in South Africa or across the continent, you have vast wealth that is not really put to the interest of the majority of the people on the continent. So it is jobs, it is addressing the inequality, and it is addressing the fundamentals of the economy to make sure that there are opportunities to add value to resources, to add manufacturing, and to improve the condition of people's lives.
All right.